Dennis Nilsen is one of the UK's most infamous serial killers. With 12 victims between 1978 and 1983, Nilsen lured, murdered, dismembered and disposed of the bodies of young men after boiling the flesh from their bodies and pouring them down the drain of his London flat. Come with me as we examine what led Dennis to this depraved act of violence. Nicknamed the British Jeffrey Dahmer, join me as we have a look at one of UK's no parole lifers. Whole life orders are a significant aspect of the UK justice system, reserved for the most heinous of crimes. These sentences mean that the convicted person will spend the rest of their life in prison without the possibility of parole. With some of this country's most infamous criminals and some of those whose crimes have faded from public consciousness. There has been a total of 116 handed out, with 89 of these still alive and serving time behind the bars of UK's most notorious prisons. This series will examine those 112 men and 4 women, their lives, motives, crimes, captures, trial, and life in prison. Welcome to No Parole. Dennis Nilsen was born to Elizabeth Guthrie White and Olvert Magnuson on the 23rd of November 1945 in Fraserburgh, Aberdeenshire. The middle child of 3, Dennis's father, who later adopted the name Nilsen, was a Norwegian soldier who had travelled to Scotland in 1940 as part of the Free Norwegian Forces following the German occupation of Norway. Dennis's parents married young and his father, Olav, focusing on his work in the Norwegian army. All 3 of the children were conceived on brief visits to their mothers. Divorce quickly followed and Elizabeth came to rely on her parents, Andrew and Lily. They were doting grandparents to all 3 and provided support during the divorce. Dennis was a subdued but intrepid child growing up in the Aberdeenshire countryside with his 2 siblings, mother and grandparents. His grandparents were a religious couple focusing on Christian teachings. Dennis says his fondest memories are of his grandfather, Alex White, taking long walks along the coastline at the age of 5. He's quoted as saying, "Very long, along the harbour, across the wide stretch of beach up to the sand dunes, which rise 30 feet behind the beach and onto Ivanalocky." Dennis said he had a content childhood, spending time with his hero and protector, his grandfather, a fisherman. Nilsen would speak later on when his grandfather was at sea, "My life would be empty until he returned." Childhood that may be difficult without a dad, but has found an idol in his grandfather, who loved him and his siblings, providing an idyllic Highland countryside life. This was until October 31st, 1951. With his grandfather struggling with his health and refusing to retire, he suffered a heart attack while at sea and passed away. His body was returned to shore and returned home. Dennis recalled one of the most evocative memories of his childhood was when his mother, weeping at the death of her own father, asked 6-year-old Dennis if he wanted to see his grandfather. He was led into the room to see the body of his hero laying in an open coffin. Nilsen was stunned by the body, his first time dealing with death. His mother told him his grandfather was sleeping and that he had gone to a better place. You don't need to be a psychiatrist to see the profound effect that this would have on young Dennis. He would spend more time alone, isolating himself from the rest of the family, spending time watching the boats his grandfather used to work on, struggling to interact with any adult members of his family, and only playing games with his sister Sylvia. On one of his trips to the beach at Ilverlochie in 1955, age 11, Dennis was swept out to sea, struggling, flailing, shouting, and going further out with every second. He gasped for air that wasn't there. He pictured his grandfather coming to his rescue and being pulled into his arms. With this, he felt a huge sense of tranquility as he drifted off. That was until a nearby youth swam and pulled Dennis from the sea. Dennis was shaken by the ordeal. The tranquility with death would stick with him. Shortly after this, in 1955, Dennis's mother remarried to Andrew Scott, a builder. The family moved to Stricken, further north in Aberdeenshire. Andrew and Elizabeth had 4 more children between 1956 and 1960, all within a small Scottish flat. Dennis resented his stepfather, who he saw as an unfair disciplinarian. However, he did grow to respect Andrew Scott. During his teenage years in Stricken, Dennis discovered he was gay, a difficult time for any young man in the 1960s Scotland town. He tried to suppress his sexuality. This led him to sexually assaulting his own sister. He believed that the slender features of the boys he found attractive were similar to his sister, and he believed this may mean he was bisexual. He did not seek sexual contact with any of the boys of his own age, only having sexual contact with an older boy. He did also sexually assault his older brother, Olaf Jr. one time as he slept. Because of this, his brother ridiculed and bullied Dennis publicly. Dennis, age 14, joined the Army Cadets as an avenue to joining the British Army as a way to elevate his standings. He disliked the countryside home and felt very few opportunities were available to him. His family, with 7 children, was poor and felt embarrassed to bring her friends home, as he believed others would judge him harshly due to his family home. Nilsen was an above-average student, having a knack for art and history. He did not engage in sports. He left school in 1961, getting a job at a local canning factory. This was only a stopgap, as he wished to join the army due to his love of his time in cadets. He informed his parents and enrolled as a chef, passing his entrance exams, and joined the Army Catering Corps at St Irma Barracks in Aldershot, Hampshire, southern England. Dennis feared his sexuality would be discovered and refused to shower with his colleagues in the barracks due to his worry that he would become sexually aroused. In mid-1964, Nilsen passed his initial catering exam and was officially signed to the 1st Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers in Onnersbruck, West Germany, where he served as a private. Dennis began to develop a drinking problem. With ready access to the canteen, he drank to excess, which in a camp full of British squaddies is saying something. He drank to overcome his shyness, to be one of the boys. On one outing off base, Dennis and a local German youth drank to excess and returned to the young German's flat. No sexual activity happened, but it revealed a new fantasy to Dennis. A young, slender, unconscious, passive, and fully able to be controlled by Nilsen. Nilsen would frequently drink with his army buddies and pretend to pass out, in a hope they would fulfill one end of his sexual fantasies, hoping they would take advantage of him as he lay pretending to be unconscious. Following 2 years of service in Onnersbruck, Nilsen returned to Aldershot, where he passed his official catering exam before being deployed to serve as a cook for the British Army in Norway. He was deployed to the state of Aden, now part of Yemen, where he again served as a cook in the Al Mansour prison. This posting was more dangerous than his previous postings in West Germany or Norway, and Nilsen later recalled his regiment losing several men, often in ambushes en route to the army barracks. Nilsen was kidnapped by an Arab taxi driver who beat him unconscious and placed him in the boot of his car. Upon being dragged out of the boot, Nilsen grabbed a jack handle and knocked the taxi driver from the ground before beating him unconscious. He then locked the man in the boot of his own taxi. Dennis, during this time, gained a fascination with sexual fantasies around having complete control over his partner, wanting them to be unconscious or even deceased. No matter how much he fantasized, these twisted ideas could not be satisfied. Dennis began to pleasure himself in front of mirrors, lying down on the floor with his head just out of view of the reflection, so he could picture himself as an unconscious victim. He imagined himself as both the aggressor and the victim. This gave Dennis the feeling of splitting his personality by picturing his near-death experiences, the beach as a child and the kidnapping by the taxi driver, and even the corpses he had seen of the locals in his posting in Aden. He pictured the artwork of Theodore Géricault, a French artist. His piece, The Raft of Medusa, which depicts a raft after the wreck of the frigate Medusa, in which an older man cradles the body of a young man, while the corpses of others sit around them. Dennis had twisted this piece of art to his own twisted ideas, describing it as a slender, attractive, young blonde soldier who'd recently been killed in battle is dominated by a faceless, dirty, grey-haired old man who washed this body before engaging in intercourse with the spread eagle corpse. Dennis left Aden and continued in the army as a cook, serving in Plymouth, Cyprus, and landing eventually in West Berlin. He engaged in acts with a local prostitute to keep up appearances to his fellow soldiers, but found the event unsatisfying and unable to fulfill his sexual needs. Nilsen ended his military career after 11 years, achieving the rank of corporal. He returned to his family home in October 1972, but this was short-lived after the family watched a documentary on gay rights. Dennis, still closeted at the time, defended gay rights. This led to an argument, and his brother outed him as gay to his family. Dennis left Scotland after moving to London to join the Met Police Force. As a cadet, he struggled to arrest anyone, physically unable to restrain those resisting. In the autumn of 1973, Dennis was able to explore freely his sexuality, frequenting casual encounters with other men. He would describe these hookups as soul-destroying. Dennis resigned from the police force in 1973 and took a job in the job centre. This role suited Dennis, and he was promoted through the business. Nilsen entered a casual relationship with a 20-year-old unemployed man called David Galachan, after stopping him from being assaulted outside a pub in London. The two hit it off and they decided to move in together. Dennis's father had recently passed away and left him an inheritance. This was used to move into the now infamous 195 Melrose Avenue, the ground floor flat. Galachan and Nilsen were not a loving couple and rarely intimate. Dennis was rarely violent to David, but he was verbally aggressive at multiple times. After a particularly heated argument, Dennis asked David to leave the home and the relationship ended shortly after. Alone and isolated, Dennis turned to drink. With casual hookups, he felt empty, alone, and incapable of being loved. He threw himself into his work. This may have been the breaking point for Dennis, as soon after, in 1978, he would begin his house of horror with his first murder. 14-year-old Stephen Holmes met Dennis in the Cricklewood Arms not far from Dennis's house. Stephen, underage, could not get served at the bar. Dennis, who had been drinking all day, began chatting to Stephen, inviting him back to his flat. They drank to excess all night and listening to music as they both fell asleep. Dennis awoke in the morning to find the young man unconscious. Like so many of his fantasies, he caressed his neck. He did not want to wake the 14-year-old in case he left me. Dennis did not want to be alone and grabbed a nearby necktie and straddling the young Holmes, he strangled the youth until he was fully unconscious. He moved the knocked out Stephen and drowned him in a bucket of water. He placed the body on the bed before masturbating over the corpse. He stowed the body below the floorboards. Bound in rope, it remained under Dennis's feet for 8 months, until on the 11th of August 1979, he built a bonfire in the garden of 195 Melrose Avenue and burnt the body. Reflecting on his killing spree in 1983, Nilsen stated that, having killed Holmes, "I caused the dreams which caused death. This is my crime," adding that he had started down the avenue of death and possession of a new kind of flatmate. "I eased him into his new bed beneath the floorboards. A week later, I wondered whether this body had changed at all, or started to decompose. I disinterred him and pulled the dirt-stained youth up onto the floor. His skin was very dirty. I stripped myself naked and carried him to the bathroom and washed the body. There was practically no discoloration of the skin. He was pale white. His limbs were more relaxed than when I'd put him down there." On October 1979, Nilsen attempted to murder a student from Hong Kong named Andrew Ho, whom he had met in the St. Martin's Lane pub and lured him back to his flat on the promise of sex. Nilsen attempted to strangle Ho, who had managed to flee the flat and reported the incident to the police. Nilsen was questioned in relation to the incident, but Ho decided not to press charges. 2 months after this, in December 3rd, 1979, Dennis met 23-year-old Kenneth Ockenden, a Canadian student who'd been visiting family over the Christmas holiday between semesters. They met in London's West End, sharing a drink in a pub when Dennis discovered Kenneth was a tourist and offered to show Ockenden the sights of London. After a tour of the theatres of the West End, Dennis offered to come back to his Melrose flat with the promise of more drinks and a meal. They returned home, and after drinking and music, Nilsen stuck up behind Kenneth and wrapped the nearby wire of his headphones around his neck, strangling him. Dennis purchased a Polaroid camera the next day and proceeded to photograph Kenneth Ockenden's body in suggestive positions. He eventually spread the body like that of the young man in the painting he was obsessed about, The Raft of Medusa. He again wrapped the body in plastic and stuffed it, just like his first victim, below his floorboards. He would continuously remove Kenneth's body from its shallow grave and placing it sitting upright in a chair, share a drink with it, and watch TV with the dead. Nilsen struck for a third time. His victim he described as the youngest looking I had ever seen. He was 16-year-old Martin Duffrey, a student of catering who had run away from home to London. He slept in Euston Station before a random chance Nilsen offered him a meal and a bed for the evening. Martin took this simple act of kindness from a stranger. But as the young man slept, Dennis Nilsen placed a wire around the neck and sat with his full weight on Kenneth's chest and tightened and pulled with such grace force that the youth passed out. He then drowned the unconscious youth in the kitchen sink and washed his body as he had done before. Dennis proceeded to kiss, caress and masturbate on top of the body for days, only relenting after Nilsen noticed the bloating of the corpse. He was too placed under the floorboards alongside Kenneth Ockenden. It's 1980 and Dennis's murders increased in frequency, as did his comfort around death. 5 further victims were pulled from beneath the floorboards, with only one being identified of William Sutherland. He was 26. Nilsen's recollections of the unidentified victims were vague, but he graphically recalled how each victim had been murdered and how long the body had retained before dissection. One unidentified victim, killed in November, had moved his legs in a cycling motion as he was strangled. Nilsen called in sick for work between the 11th and 18th of November due to this particular murder. Another unidentified victim, Nilsen had unsuccessfully attempted to resuscitate before sinking to his knees and sobbing. He then spat at his own image as he looked at himself in the mirror. On another occasion, he had lain in bed alongside the body of an unidentified victim as he listened to the classical theme fanfare for the common man before bursting into tears. The 7 bodies under his floorboards, of course, now started to produce a vile smell as the summer hit London. He would pull up the floor, see his victims covered in maggots and then pulsating out of the eyes and mouth. He would place air fresheners below the floorboards and spray bug spray. But unsurprisingly, Febreze would not cover the decay of 7 victims. In 1980, the smell would become too much for the small flat, and Dennis removed and dismembered each of the bodies, placing them on a bonfire behind his house with an old car tyre on top to help mask the smell. During 1981, Dennis murdered 3 further victims who remain unidentified to this day. His final victim at Melrose Avenue was 23-year-old Malcolm Barlow, a young man who Nilsen had found slumped against a wall after his epilepsy medication had caused him to collapse. Dennis helped the young man, phoning an ambulance. Malcolm was discharged from hospital and went to find Dennis. This kind stranger had helped him in his time of need. Dennis offered him dinner and a drink, and when Malcolm fell asleep on the sofa of Melrose Avenue, he was strangled and his body hidden under the sink. In the summer of 1981, the landlord wished to renovate the flat and asked Dennis to vacate it. Obviously, Dennis couldn't let this happen, and was only convinced after the landlord had offered him £1,000, around $3,700 today or $5,000, and also offered Dennis time to get his orders in a fair. With this, Dennis set to work disposing of the remaining bodies much in the same way he had done before, dissecting the bodies as best he could and burning them on a bonfire with a car tyre on top. Nilsen's new house of horrors, 23 Cranley Gardens, did not have a garden or floorboards to pull up to hide bodies, so for 2 months he made no attempt to claim another victim. But in 1982, Dennis met 23-year-old John Howlett. Like so many of his victims, he invited him back to his flat and proceeded to drink with them until they fell unconscious before attacking. This time was different. John was able to fight back until Nilsen placed an upholstery strap around John's neck. With this, Dennis thought he had killed John, but at least twice John regained consciousness and fought with Dennis. Eventually, Nilsen did knock him out again and drowned him in the bathtub. John, in the struggle, had left bruises in the shape of fingers around Dennis's neck that were noted by Dennis's work colleagues over the following weeks. In May 1982, 21-year-old Carl Stotter, down on his luck after a breakup, drowned his sorrows in the Black Cat pub in Camden. Nilsen could sense vulnerability and used the same methods as before to lure him back to the flat. Carl passed out on an open sleeping bag and awoke to Nilsen strangling him, with Dennis loudly whispering, "Stay still." Stotter believed Dennis was trying to free him from the sleeping bag before he went unconscious. He then recalled being woken by the sound of running water before being plunged into Nilsen's bath. Struggling against Dennis, Carl called out, "No more, please, no more," before falling unconscious once again. Nilsen believed he had killed Carl, placing his body in an armchair. That wasn't until Dennis's dog Bleep began licking Carl's face, alerting Dennis that he was still alive. Oddly, Nilsen began wrapping Carl in blankets in hopes to increase circulation. He explained to the young man that he had been panicking and he was strangling himself on the zip of the sleeping bag and that Dennis had resuscitated him. Dennis nursed Carl to health over the next few days and walked him to a nearby train station and wished him well, sending him on his way. Carl would not report this incident to the police, only bravely coming forward after Nilsen was caught and presenting this evidence in court. Nilsen's next victim was 27-year-old Graham Allen, who Dennis met on Shaftesbury Avenue. Nilsen invited Graham to his home for a meal, strangling him as he sat eating an omelette. Allen's body was stored in the bathtub for 3 days before the start of dismemberment. It's January 26, 1983. And 20-year-old Stephen Sinclair is last seen by friends strolling with a stranger in the tube station. It was Dennis, inviting and manipulating another vulnerable young man to his home, plying him with a hot meal, a bed, drugs and alcohol. They both indulged in drink and they listened to the opera inspired by the music of The Who, Tommy. Nilsen knelt before Sinclair and said, "Oh, Stephen, here I go again. before attacking Sinclair with a basic ligature made of a necktie and rope. Nilsen stripped, washed and placed the body on his bed, surrounding the bed with mirrors and falling asleep beside the body after kissing him on the head and saying, "Good night, Stephen." He dismembered the body and placed various parts in a bag, securing them with bandages that had been on Stephen's wrists from a recent suicide attempt. Stephen Sinclair was Nilsen's last victim, bringing his total to 15, with many unidentified. He began disposing of the bodies by dismembering and boiling the heads to remove the flesh, before attempting to flush them down the toilet. On the 4th of February 1983, these drains became blocked, with Nilsen himself writing a letter to the landlord. Then, 4 days later, on the 8th of February, Michael Cateran of Dino Road responded to the complaints on behalf of the landlord. He opened the drain at the side of the house, noting the drain was packed with what looked like flesh and small bones. Cateran, obviously confused by the blockage, phoned his supervisor, and as it was the end of the working day, agreed to return the next morning to start work. Before leaving, he ran into Nilsen and another tenant, explaining, "It looks like somebody's been flushing down their Kentucky Fried Chicken." The plumbers returned next morning at 7:30 a.m, which by the time they opened the drain, it had been cleared. This made both men suspicious. They opened the pipes, including one connecting to the top floor flat where Nilsen lived. In this pipe, they found flesh and small bones. They contacted the police and the bones were taken to a local pathologist, David Bowen. He informed investigators that the bones were that of a human neck bone with ligature marks across it. The police, upon learning this, opted to wait for Nilsen to return from work. When he did return, they joined him up in his top floor flat to discuss the drain. Upon informing him that the human remains had been found in his pipes, Nilsen feigned shock, to which Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. replied, "Don't mess about. Where's the rest of the body?" Nilsen, without skipping a beat, calmly looked in the officer's eye and admitted that the rest of the body was in 2 plastic bags in the wardrobe. Nilsen explained, "It's a long story. It goes back a long time. I'll tell you everything I want to get it off my chest. Not here. At the police station." He was then arrested and cautioned on suspicion of murder before being taken to Hornsley Police Station. While en route to the police station, Nilsen was asked whether the remains of the flat belonged to one person or two. Staring out the window of the police car, he replied, 15 or 16, since 1978. That night, the flat was searched, in which the plastic bags in the wardrobe was 2 torsos, with one dissected vertically, a shopping bag of various organs, the other bag contained a skull, severed head, another torso with arms still attached but the hands missing. A further search for additional remains at Cranley Gardens on the 10th of February revealed the lower section of a torso and 2 legs stowed in a bag in the bathroom, a skull, a section of torso and various bones in a tea chest. The same day, Nilsen accompanied police to Melrose Avenue, where he indicated the 3 locations in the rear garden where he'd burned the remains of his victims. At 7:40 p.m. on the 11th of February, Nilsen was charged with Sinclair's murder, and a statement revealing this was released to the press. Formal questioning of Nilsen began in the same evening. Police interviewed Nilsen on 16 separate occasions over the following days, in interviews which totaled over 30 hours. Nilsen was adamant that he was uncertain as to why he had killed, simply saying, "I was hoping you'd tell me that." When asked his motive for the murders, he was adamant that the decision to kill was not made until moments before the act of murder. Most victims had died by strangulation. On several occasions he had drowned the victims once they had been strangled into unconsciousness. Once the victim had been killed, he typically bathed the victim's body, shaved any hair from the torso to conform with his physical ideals, and then applied makeup to any obvious blemishes upon the skin. The body was usually dressed in socks and underpants before Nilsen draped the victims around him as he talked to the corpse. With most victims, Nilsen masturbated as he stood alongside or knelt above the body, and Nilsen confessed to having occasionally engaged in intercrucial sex with the victim's body, but repeatedly stressed to investigators that he had never actually penetrated his victims, explaining the victims were too perfect and beautiful for the pathetic ritual of commonplace sex. Nilsen saw victims as props in his sexual fancies. He used and disposed of as he wished. He would pose them in parts of his home before decomposition would take hold. Sitting next to them as he watched TV or listened to music, he was adamant he never performed penetrative sex on the bodies, insisting he would masturbate alongside them or on top of them, saying this was his way of saying goodbye to his victims. On the 26th of May, Nilsen was given a court date to stand trial for 5 counts of murder, with a 6th being added later. Dennis initially agreed to plead guilty to all charges, But on the day of the hearing, after dismissing his lawyer and instating a new one, he pled not guilty to all charges on the grounds of diminished responsibility. The court proceeding started on the 24th of October 1983 with Justice Gruesome Johnson leading the hearing. The act of murder committed by Mr. Dennis Nilsen was not in question, but whether or not he was in the right mind and able to be tried as sane or insane, and therefore faced the lesser charge of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. The prosecution opened up by detailing how human remains were discovered in the drains of Nilsen's Cranley residence on February 1983, leading to his arrest. They described the discovery of dismembered bodies at his property and Nilsen's subsequent confession, in which he admitted to killing several men at his previous address in Melrose Avenue. The prosecution highlighted Nilsen's efforts to conceal his crimes and argued that even if Nilsen had a mental abnormality, it is not sufficient enough to diminish his responsibilities for the killing. The prosecution called several witnesses who had survived Nilsen's attacks. The first, Douglas Stewart, testified that Nilsen had tried to strangle him in 1980. Although Stewart overpowered Nilsen and escaped, the incident was dismissed by police at the time as a lover's quarrel. On cross-examination, the defence attempted to undermine Stewart's credibility by pointing out the inconsistencies of his testimony and the fact that they had both been drinking heavily on the night of the attack. Two other survivors, Paul Nobbs and the previously talked about Carl Slaughter, had testified. Nobbs and a university student described how he woke up in Nilsen's flat with a severe headache and bloodshot eyes after an attack. Nilsen had told him to see a doctor, which the prosecution used as evidence of Nilsen's self-control. The defence countered by suggesting that Nilsen's inability to control his impulsive was indicative of mental illness. Stotter emotionally recounted how Nilsen had attempted to strangle and drown him before reviving him, which she described as traumatic and a terrifying experience. Nilsen's written statements to the police were also presented, including one where he expressed no remorse for his victims or himself. Detective Inspector Peter J. testified about Nilsen's calm and matter-of-fact confessions, noting how Nilsen had provided detailed information that helped the police gather evidence against him. This included graphic descriptions of how Nilsen dismembered and disposed of the victims' bodies, which visibly disturbed the jury. The defence called two psychiatrists, James McKeith and Patrick Galway, to testify against Nilsen's mental state. McKeith argued that Nilsen suffered from an unspecified personality disorder, which led to his inability to express emotions and caused him to depersonalise his victims. He suggested that Nilsen's behaviour was the result of a severe personality disorder that reduced his responsibility for the murders. Galway diagnosed Nilsen with a borderline narcissistic personality disorder and with schizoid tendencies, which he claimed caused Nilsen to act impulsively and violently during episodes of mental breakdowns. In rebuttal, the prosecution called psychiatrist Paul Bowden, who had interviewed Nilsen extensively. Bowden testified that although Nilsen was abnormal in a general sense, he did not suffer from any disorder of the mind that would have impaired his ability to understand the criminal nature of his actions. Bowden described Nilsen as a manipulative individual who was fully capable of forming relationships and making decisions, thus refuting the defence's argument of diminished responsibility. After closing arguments from both sides, the jury deliberated and returned on the 4th of November 1983 with the majority verdict. Nilsen was found guilty of 6 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder, with a unanimous verdict on the attempted murder of Nobbs. The judge, Mr. Justice Gruesome Johnson, sentenced Nilsen to life imprisonment with the recommendation that he serve at least 25 years. Nilsen never appealed against his sentencing, both the original and when it was turned to a whole life order. He accepted the prosecution's case that he had the capacity to control his actions and that the murders were premeditated. Dennis was classified as Class A prisoner, the highest category of security in UK prison system. He was given his own cell in Woodworm Scrubs prison, but allowed to mix freely with other inmates. In December 1983, Dennis was attacked by fellow prisoner Albert Moffat. His motive is unclear, but after a savage attack with a razor blade, Nilsen required 83 stitches to his face and was transferred to a vulnerable prison unit. Eventually, he ended up in HMP Full Sutton, where he spent time translating books to Braille, and he spent most of his free time reading, painting and writing. He died on the 12th of May 2018 in York Hospital after pulmonary embolism and a retropenal hemorrhage. He was 72 years old. Thank you for joining us here at So It Goes Productions, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Please like and subscribe. Feel free to click on the playlist in the video to continue with the rest of the series. And thank you for watching.